Sometimes the darkest moments in our lives become the doorway to our greatest blessings. When tragedy strikes and all hope seems lost, when children are left with nothing but fear and empty stomachs, when the world turns its back on the most vulnerable, that's when miracles have room to breathe. This is the true story of three siblings who lost everything in a single morning, only to discover that home isn't a place you're born into, but a place where love chooses to find you. It's about a gruff rancher who thought his heart had dried up like the Texas soil during drought season, and how sometimes the family we need most comes to us not through blood, but through the raw, beautiful decision to open our door when others would close theirs. Get ready for a journey that will remind you that even when morning brings the worst news imaginable, by sunset, everything can change, if we're brave enough to let strangers become family. The summer sun had barely kissed the horizon when 9-year-old Sarah Martinez heard her mother's labored breathing stop. She had been sitting beside the thin mattress on the floor, holding her mama's cold hand, waiting for the miracle that never came. Behind her, 6-year-old Miguel clutched his wooden toy horse, the paint chipped from years of love and rough play, while 3-year-old Elena slept curled against the wall, unaware that their world had just crumbled into dust. Their small apartment in the rundown section of Brownsville, Texas, felt even smaller now. The walls seemed to press closer, the silence deafening except for Miguel's quiet sniffles as he began to understand what Sarah already knew. Mama wasn't going to wake up anymore. Maria Martinez had fought cancer for 3 years, working double shifts at the diner when she could stand, selling everything of value when she couldn't. The medical bills had eaten through their savings like hungry wolves, leaving them with nothing but each other and a pile of notices threatening eviction. She had been everything to them: mother, father, protector, and provider, all wrapped into one fierce woman who refused to give up even when her body began to fail her. Sarah tried to remember everything her mother had told her about taking care of Miguel and Elena. At 9 years old, she felt ancient, carrying responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. She knew how to make scrambled eggs, how to braid Elena's hair, how to read Miguel a bedtime story, and how to count the few dollars they had left. $23 and some coins scattered on the kitchen table. That was their inheritance. By noon, their landlord, Mr. Henderson, was knocking on the door. Sarah didn't answer at first, hoping he would go away, but his knocking grew louder and more impatient. When she finally opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain latched, his expression told her he already knew. "I heard the ambulance earlier," he said, his voice not entirely unkind, but firm with business. "I'm sorry about your mother, girl, but you kids can't stay here alone. I'll give you until tomorrow morning to figure something out, but then I need this apartment back." Sarah's throat felt like sandpaper. "We don't have anywhere to go." Henderson shifted uncomfortably, looking over her shoulder into the dim apartment. "Don't you have family? Grandparents? An aunt or uncle?" She shook her head. Mama had told her once that they were all alone in the world, that her own parents had died when Sarah was still a baby, and that there was no one else. No cousins, no distant relatives who might take in 3 orphan children. Just them against the world, and now just the 3 of them against everything. "Child services will come for you if you don't have a plan," Henderson continued, his voice softer now. "They'll split you up, put you in different homes. That's not what you want, is it?" The words hit Sarah like ice water. Split up? She thought of Miguel, who still sometimes went to bed when he had nightmares, and Elena, who wouldn't eat unless Sarah sang to her. They needed to stay together. They were all they had left of their mama, all they had left of their family. After Henderson left, Sarah sat her siblings down on the worn couch that Mama had bought at a garage sale years ago. Elena climbed into her lap, sensing something was wrong, even though she didn't understand what death meant. Miguel sat close beside them, his dark eyes wide and frightened. "Mama went to heaven this morning," Sarah told them, her voice stronger than she felt. "And we need to figure out what to do next." Elena looked around the room, then back at Sarah. "When is Mama coming back?" The question broke something inside Sarah's chest, but she kept her voice steady. "She's not coming back, Elena, but we're going to be okay. I'm going to take care of us." Miguel was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the serious expression he'd worn more and more as Mama got sicker. Finally, he asked, "Where are we going to live?" Sarah wished she had an answer. She thought about the $23 on the table, about the bags of rice, and beans in their small pantry, about the fact that she was 9 years old and responsible for two younger children with no plan and nowhere to turn. That afternoon, while Elena napped and Miguel played quietly with his horse, Sarah walked to the small church where Mama sometimes took them on Sundays when she felt strong enough. Father Miguel, who shared her brother's name and had always been kind to their family, listened as she explained her situation. He was a gentle man in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes that reminded Sarah of her grandfather in the one photograph Mama had kept. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded in his lap, his expression growing more concerned as she spoke. "Your mother was a good woman," he said finally. "Strong and brave. She loved you children more than anything in this world." Sarah nodded, waiting for him to tell her what to do, hoping he had answers she didn't. "I wish I could take you in myself," Father Miguel continued, "but the church doesn't have facilities for children, and I'm too old to be approved for guardianship. But there might be another option." He told her about families in their congregation who had helped children before, about the possibility of finding someone who could take all three of them together. It wasn't a guarantee, he warned her, but it was hope. "Can you give me until tomorrow?" Father Miguel asked. "Let me make some calls, see what I can arrange." Sarah agreed, knowing she didn't have much choice. 24 hours to find a miracle, or watch her family get torn apart by a system that didn't understand that some bonds couldn't be broken. That evening, she fed Elena and Miguel the last of their cereal and milk, then tucked them into the bed they all shared. Elena asked again when Mama was coming home, and Miguel wanted to know if they would have to go to school tomorrow. Sarah answered as best she could, making up stories about angels and promises about staying together, even though she wasn't sure she could keep them. As the children slept, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound in the building. She thought about their neighbors, Mrs. Rodriguez, who worked nights and barely had enough to feed her own 4 children, and Mr. Johnson, who drank too much and yelled at his television. None of them were options for taking in 3 orphan kids. She remembered Mama's stories about growing up on a farm somewhere in Central Texas, about wide open spaces and kind people who helped each other without being asked. But those stories felt like fairy tales now, too distant and unlikely to be real solutions for children with nowhere to go. At some point during the long night, Sarah made a decision. If Father Miguel couldn't find anyone to take them, if the only option was being split up, then she would take Miguel and Elena, and they would disappear. She didn't know where they would go or how they would survive, but she knew they had to stay together. It was what Mama would have wanted, what Mama would have done if she were still here to protect them. The morning came too soon, gray and humid like most Texas summer days. Sarah woke Miguel and Elena, helped them dress in their cleanest clothes, and divided the last banana between them. She packed their few belongings into 2 grocery bags. Changes of clothes, Elena's stuffed rabbit, Miguel's wooden horse, and the photograph of Mama holding all 3 of them from last Christmas. Father Miguel had said he would call by 10 o'clock. Sarah watched the clock on the microwave, its green numbers moving too fast and too slow at the same time. At exactly 10 o'clock, the phone rang. "I found someone," Father Miguel said, and Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief. "There's a man about an hour north of here who might be able to help. His name is Thomas Crawford, and he has a ranch outside a small town called Cedar Creek. He's lost some people too, and he might understand what you're going through." Sarah wrote down the address with a pencil stub on a piece of paper bag, her hands shaking slightly. Father Miguel offered to drive them out there himself, to make the introduction and ensure they were safe. It wasn't a permanent solution, he warned her, just a possibility, but it was better than the alternatives they faced. As they loaded their few possessions into Father Miguel's old sedan, Sarah took one last look at the apartment that had been their home. It wasn't much, but it was where Mama had sung them to sleep, where she had made birthday cakes from box mix, where she had told them stories about being brave and strong and taking care of each other. Elena held her rabbit tight, while Miguel clutched his wooden horse and stared out the window as they drove away from everything they had known. Sarah sat between them in the back seat, one arm around each of her siblings, watching their neighborhood disappear behind them and wondering what kind of man this Thomas Crawford was, and whether he would see 3 lost children or 3 mouths he couldn't afford to feed. The drive north took them through small towns and farmland, past fields of corn and pastures where cattle gathered under shade trees. The landscape was different from the city, more open and quiet, with houses spread far apart, and roads that stretched toward horizons she had never seen before. As they got closer to Cedar Creek, Sarah felt her heart beating faster. In a few minutes, she would meet the man who might save her family, or who might turn them away with nowhere left to go. Everything depended on what happened next, on whether a stranger would look at 3 children with nothing and decide they were worth the trouble of keeping together. Thomas Crawford stood on his front porch, watching the dust cloud approach down his long gravel driveway. At 52 years old, he had grown accustomed to solitude, to the quiet rhythms of ranch life, and to the echoing silence of a house built for a family that no longer existed. His weathered hands gripped the porch railing as Father Miguel's sedan came into view, carrying 3 children who would either become his responsibility or break his heart all over again. The ranch stretched across 800 acres of central Texas hill country, with rolling pastures where his cattle grazed and a creek that ran year-round through the center of the property. The house itself was a modest ranch-style structure built in the 1960s, with 3 bedrooms that had been empty for too long and a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the apple pies his wife used to bake. Thomas had not planned on this phone call from Father Miguel, had not expected to be asked to consider taking in 3 orphan children when his own life felt like it was held together with old fence wire and stubborn determination. But something in the priest's voice, some desperate note that reminded him of his own pleas to God during the worst days of his life, had made him say yes before he could think better of it. 5 years ago, Thomas Crawford had been a different man. He had been a husband to Mary, his high school sweetheart who sang while she cooked and left little notes in his lunchbox even after 20 years of marriage. He had been a father to their twins, Jacob and Jennifer, who had filled the ranch house with laughter and muddy footprints and the kind of chaos that makes a house feel alive. Then came the accident on a rainy November evening, when an 18-wheeler ran a red light and took his entire world away in the space of 3 heartbeats. Mary died instantly. The twins, 15 years old and full of plans for the future, lived long enough for him to hold their hand in the hospital and tell them he loved them one last time. In the years since, Thomas had thrown himself into ranch work, rising before dawn to tend cattle, mending fences that didn't need mending, and avoiding the parts of his house that still held echoes of his family's voices. He had become known around Cedar Creek as a good neighbor, but a solitary man, someone who would help you move cattle or repair a broken windmill, but who rarely stayed for dinner or lingered for conversation. The townspeople understood his grief and gave him space. Mrs. Henderson from the general store still saved him homemade cookies, leaving them on his truck seat when he wasn't looking. Doc Reynolds, who had delivered the twins and treated them for everything from broken bones to strep throat, still stopped by once a month to check on Thomas and drink coffee on the porch. But nobody pushed him to rejoin the world, and Thomas had been content to live in the margins of his own life. When Father Miguel called, explaining about 3 children who needed a place to stay, Thomas's first instinct was to say no. What did he know about taking care of kids? His own children had been nearly grown when he lost them, old enough to take care of themselves in many ways. These were young children, babies really, who would need more than he knew how to give. But as Father Miguel continued talking, describing 9-year-old Sarah who was trying to hold her family together, Thomas found himself remembering his own sister Annie, who had raised him after their parents died in a farming accident when he was 12. Annie had been only 19 herself, barely an adult, but she had taken on the responsibility without hesitation. She had worked 2 jobs and made sure he finished school, made sure he learned to drive, and helped him apply for college scholarships. Annie had taught him that family wasn't always about blood, that sometimes it was about who showed up when everyone else walked away. She had died of breast cancer 10 years ago, but her lessons about duty and love and taking care of people who couldn't take care of themselves had stayed with him. As the sedan pulled up to his house, Thomas could see 3 small faces peering out the windows. The oldest girl, Sarah, was sitting very straight, her arms protectively around the 2 smaller children. Even from a distance, he could see the weight she was carrying, the responsibility that had aged her beyond her 9 years. Father Miguel got out first, his familiar smile doing little to hide his own nervousness about this arrangement. He had known Thomas for years, had presided over Mary and the twins' funeral, had checked on him periodically during the darkest months afterward. But asking a grieving man to take on 3 orphan children was a request that went beyond normal friendship. "Thomas," Father Miguel said, shaking his hand, Thank you for agreeing to meet them. The children climbed out of the car slowly, staying close together. Sarah held Elena's hand while Miguel pressed close to his sister's other side, his toy horse clutched against his chest. Thomas could see they were scared, but try not to show it, the way children do when they know the adults in their lives are making decisions that will change everything. You must be Sarah, Thomas said, crouching down to her level. Father Miguel told me about you and your brother and sister. Sarah nodded, studying his face with serious eyes that seemed too old for a 9-year-old. Yes, sir. This is Miguel and Elena. We don't have anywhere else to go. The simple honesty of it hit Thomas harder than he had expected. No pleading, no dramatic tears, just a statement of fact delivered by a child who had already learned that life was neither fair nor predictable. Elena peeked out from behind Sarah, her dark eyes wide with curiosity and fear. Miguel stepped forward slightly, extending his hand with surprising formality for a 6-year-old. Thank you for letting us come to your house, Miguel said politely, his mother's training and manners still evident despite everything they had been through. Thomas shook the small hand, feeling the slight tremor that betrayed the boy's nervousness. Why don't we go inside and talk, he suggested, leading them up the porch steps. The house felt different with children in it, their small voices echoing in rooms that had been silent too long. Thomas made coffee for himself and Father Miguel, while Sarah helped Elena and Miguel wash their hands in the kitchen sink. He watched the easy way she cared for them, lifting Elena to reach the soap dispenser, helping Miguel dry his hands with the dish towel. They sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Mary used to help the twins with homework, where they had eaten thousands of meals as a family. Thomas served glasses of milk for the children and found some crackers in the pantry, watching as Sarah carefully divided everything equally among the three of them. Father Miguel explained the situation more fully. Their mother's death, the eviction notice, the lack of other family members who could take them in. He spoke in a low voice, mindful of the children listening, but Sarah's expression made it clear she already knew every detail of their circumstances. The state would prefer to place them with a licensed foster family, Father Miguel said, but finding someone willing to take all three together is difficult, and Sarah is concerned about them being separated. Thomas looked at the children, seeing how Elena automatically leaned against Sarah, how Miguel stayed within arm's reach of his sisters. They were a unit, a family that had already lost too much to be broken apart again. What kind of arrangement are we talking about? Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Temporary at first, Father Miguel said carefully, until we can find something more permanent. Maybe a few weeks, maybe longer. But Thomas could read between the lines. There was no other option waiting in the wings, no backup plan if this didn't work out. These children needed more than a few weeks of shelter. They needed stability, security, a place to heal from the trauma of loss. After Father Miguel left, promising to check back in a few days, Thomas found himself alone with 3 children who looked at him like he might disappear at any moment. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Elena tugged on Sarah's sleeve and whispered something in her ear. She needs to use the bathroom, Sarah translated, standing quickly. Thomas showed them down the hall, past the closed doors of rooms he hadn't entered in years. The bathroom still had Mary's soap dish on the counter, her reading glasses forgotten on the shelf next to the medicine cabinet. He saw Sarah notice these details, filing them away with the instinct of a child who had learned to read adult emotions for signs of danger or safety. When they returned to the kitchen, Thomas realized he had no plan for what came next. It was mid-afternoon, and the children would need dinner, beds to sleep in, routines that made sense in their upended world. He thought about the frozen dinners in his freezer, the silence that usually filled his evenings, the television programs he watched alone. "Are you hungry?" he asked, opening the refrigerator and staring at its sparse contents. He had milk, eggs, some leftover beef from Sunday's dinner, vegetables that were beginning to look questionable. Sarah stepped beside him, studying the refrigerator with the practiced eye of someone used to making meals from limited ingredients. "I can make scrambled eggs," she offered quietly, "if that's okay." Thomas stepped back, letting her take charge. He watched as she efficiently gathered what she needed, directing Miguel to set the table and Elena to find napkins in the drawer Sarah somehow knew to check. Within 20 minutes, they were sitting down to a simple meal that felt more like family dinner than anything Thomas had experienced in 5 years. As they ate, the children slowly began to relax. Miguel told Thomas about his wooden horse, explaining that his mama had bought it for him at a flea market and that it was his most precious possession. Elena showed him her stuffed rabbit, worn soft from years of loving, and shyly asked if there were any real rabbits on the ranch. Plenty of them, Thomas told her. Wild ones, mostly. They come out early in the morning and in the evening to eat grass. Elena's eyes lit up. Can we see them? Maybe tomorrow morning, if you're up early enough. After dinner, Thomas showed them to the guest bedroom, the only spare room that didn't hold too many memories. There was a double bed and a single twin, enough space for all three if they didn't mind being close together. Sarah immediately began organizing their few belongings, hanging clothes in the closet and settling Elena's rabbit on the pillow. As he watched them prepare for bed, Thomas felt something shifting inside his chest, a loosening of the tight control he had kept over his emotions for years. These children weren't his family, weren't his responsibility, but they were here in his house, trusting him to keep them safe. That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas sat on his porch and called his sister Annie's memory into the quiet darkness. He thought about the choice she had made all those years ago to take on a grieving 12-year-old boy when she barely had the resources to take care of herself. She had never complained, never made him feel like a burden, never suggested that love was something you had to earn rather than something you gave freely. Looking up at the stars scattered across the Texas sky, Thomas began to understand that this wasn't just about providing temporary shelter for 3 orphan children. This was about the possibility that families could be formed in unexpected ways, that healing could happen when broken people chose to take care of each other. Inside the house, Sarah lay awake listening to her siblings breathe, trying to decide if this place felt safe enough to hope for. The man seemed kind, and the house was clean and quiet, but she had learned not to trust too quickly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, new tests of whether they could really stay together. But for tonight, they were under a roof that didn't leak, with full bellies and clean sheets, and that felt like more than they had dared to dream possible when they woke up that morning as orphans with nowhere to go. The first week at the Crawford Ranch unfolded like a careful dance between strangers trying to become something more. Sarah woke each morning before dawn, listening for sounds that would tell her whether they were still welcome or if this was the day they would be asked to leave. The house had its own rhythm, creaking floors and settling walls that spoke in a language she was learning to understand. Thomas, for his part, found himself navigating territory he had never expected to explore. He had forgotten how much noise children could make. Not just their voices, but the constant sound of small feet on hardwood floors, doors opening and closing, water running, the television tuned to cartoon channels that played bright, cheerful music he found both annoying and oddly comforting. The children moved through his house like careful ghosts at first, always asking permission, always apologizing for taking up space. Sarah would knock softly before entering any room, even the kitchen. Miguel would sit perfectly still during meals, hardly daring to reach for seconds. Elena spoke in whispers, as if afraid that normal volume might shatter this fragile arrangement. Thomas tried to tell them they didn't need to be so formal, but he understood their caution. They had learned that homes could disappear without warning, that safety was something that could be taken away without explanation. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford until they were certain this place wouldn't dissolve like everything else they had known. On the third day, Thomas found Sarah in the kitchen before sunrise, standing on a chair to reach the coffee maker. She was wearing one of her 2 dresses, already neat and tidy, her dark hair braided with the precision of someone who had been taking care of herself for years. "You don't have to do that," he said gently, taking the coffee filter from her small hands. "I want to help," Sarah replied, not quite meeting his eyes. "I know how to take care of things." Thomas studied her serious face, recognizing something he had seen in the mirror during the months after his family died. The desperate need to be useful, to prove worthiness through constant effort. "I know you do, but you're 9 years old. You should be worrying about 9-year-old things." "What are 9-year-old things?" Sarah asked, and the question was so genuinely confused that Thomas felt his heart crack a little. He thought about his own children at that age, how their biggest concerns had been homework, and whether they could stay up late on weekends, whether they could have friends over for sleepovers, what costume to wear for Halloween. Normal childhood worries that belonged to children who didn't have to be adults before they were ready. "Playing," he said finally. "Learning things because they're interesting, not because you have to. Reading stories just for fun. Getting dirty without worrying about laundry." Sarah considered this as if he were describing a foreign concept. What if you decide we can't stay? I need to show you we're not too much trouble. The honesty of it hit Thomas like a physical blow. Here was a child who had learned to equate her worth with her usefulness, who believed love was something earned through perfect behavior and constant service. Sarah, he said, sitting down so they were eye level. You and Miguel and Elena are not here on trial. You're here because you need a place to be safe, and I have space for you. That's all there is to it. But he could see she didn't believe him yet, couldn't allow herself to believe that safety could be unconditional. It would take more than words to convince her. As the days passed, small changes began to appear in their routine. Miguel started leaving his wooden horse on the coffee table instead of clutching it every moment. Elena began speaking in her normal voice instead of whispers, and she discovered that Thomas kept ice cream in the freezer, something their mother had rarely been able to afford. Thomas found himself making accommodations he hadn't planned. He cleared space in the hall closet for their few belongings, bought cereal and juice boxes at the grocery store, and installed a safety latch on the cabinet under the kitchen sink where he kept cleaning supplies. He had forgotten how curious young children could be, how they needed protection from their own desire to explore. The biggest change came when Elena got sick with a fever and upset stomach on her second week at the ranch. Sarah went into immediate panic mode, trying to take her sister's temperature with a cold washcloth, giving her sips of water, and hovering like a tiny nurse who had seen too much illness. Thomas called Doc Reynolds, the same doctor who had cared for his own family for years. When the older man arrived at the ranch and saw the children, his expression softened with understanding. Nothing serious, Doc Reynolds assured them after examining Elena. Just a little stomach bug. She'll be fine a day or two with rest and fluids. But Sarah's relief was so profound that she started crying, the kind of silent tears that spoke of fear held too long and released all at once. Thomas found himself kneeling beside her chair, offering tissues and quiet reassurance that Elena would be okay, that they had medicine and doctors and everything needed to make her better. I was scared she was going to die too, Sarah whispered, the words barely audible. Thomas understood then that every cough, every fever, every minor childhood ailment would be filtered through Sarah's experience of watching her mother slip away despite all their efforts to save her. The children weren't just grieving their mother's death. They were living with the terrifying knowledge that people you love could disappear without warning. That evening, as Elena slept off her fever and Miguel colored quietly at the kitchen table, Thomas sat down with Sarah to talk about what would happen next. He had been putting off this conversation, but her fear over Elena's illness made him realize they all needed more certainty about the future. Father Miguel has been working on making this arrangement more permanent, Thomas told her. There's paperwork involved, background checks, social workers who will come to visit. But if you're willing to stay, I'd like you to consider this your home. Sarah looked at him with eyes too serious for her age. What if you change your mind? What if you change yours? Thomas asked gently. What if you decide you don't like living on a ranch with an old man who talks to his cattle and eats cereal for dinner sometimes? For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Sarah smiled. You really eat cereal for dinner? When I'm too tired to cook something else, Thomas admitted. Don't tell Doc Reynolds. He already thinks my eating habits are terrible. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Sarah began to relax her vigilant supervision of her siblings, allowing Miguel to explore the barn with Thomas, and letting Elena chase the barn cats around the yard. She started asking questions about the ranch, about the cattle, about how things worked in this rural world that was so different from the urban poverty they had known. Thomas, meanwhile, found himself enjoying their company more than he had expected. Miguel was fascinated by everything about ranch life, following Thomas around, asking endless questions about the cows, the horses, the equipment. Elena had a gift for finding beauty in small things. Wildflowers in the pasture, interesting shaped rocks by the creek, cloud formations that reminded her of animals. The social worker, Mrs. Patterson, made her first visit on a Thursday afternoon. She was a kind woman in her 40s who had been doing this job long enough to recognize genuine care when she saw it. She interviewed Thomas privately, then spoke with each of the children separately, and finally observed them all together during dinner. The children seemed settled, she told Thomas after the others had gone to bed. Sarah is still very protective, but that's normal given what they've been through. Miguel and Elena are showing signs of healthy attachment. The arrangement seems to be working well. There would be more visits, more paperwork, more evaluations, but Mrs. Patterson's approval felt like the first official recognition that they were becoming a real family rather than a temporary solution to an emergency. As summer progressed, the children settled into new routines. Thomas enrolled them in the small school in Cedar Creek for the fall, a 3-room building that served kindergarten through 8th grade and where everyone knew everyone else's business. Sarah would start 4th grade, Miguel 1st grade, and Elena would attend the pre-K program 3 mornings a week. They went shopping for school clothes and supplies, an expedition that revealed how little the children were used to buying new things. Elena was amazed that she could choose between different colors of crayons. Miguel spent 20 minutes deciding between 2 nearly identical composition notebooks. Sarah carefully calculated the cost of everything in her head, still worried about being too expensive despite Thomas's repeated assurances that money wasn't a problem. The night before school started, Thomas found Sarah sitting on the front porch in the dark, looking up at the stars. She was wearing the new pajamas they had bought that afternoon, but her expression was troubled. "Nervous about tomorrow?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "What if the other kids ask about our parents?" Sarah said, "What if they want to know why we're living with you?" Thomas considered this. Small towns could be wonderful support systems, but they could also be places where differences stood out starkly. "What do you want to tell them?" "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "I don't know what we are now. Are we foster kids? Are we your family? Are we just staying here until something better comes along?" The questions hung in the night air between them. Thomas realized that while he had been thinking about practical matters, beds and meals and school enrollment, the children had been struggling with questions of identity and belonging that went much deeper than paperwork and social worker visits. "What would you like to be?" Thomas asked. Sarah was quiet for a long time, considering the question with the seriousness she brought to everything important. "I'd like to be your family," she said finally. "But I don't know if that's allowed." Thomas felt something settle into place in his chest, a decision that had been forming gradually over the past few weeks, crystallizing into certainty. "It's allowed," he said. "If that's what you want, if that's what Miguel and Elena want, then that's what we'll be." "Really?" Sarah's voice was small, hopeful in a way that made Thomas understand how much courage it had taken for her to voice this desire. "Really," Thomas confirmed. "We're already taking care of each other, already living like a family. The only thing missing is making it official." Sarah nodded, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she seemed to truly relax, the constant tension in her small shoulders finally easing. "Can we tell Miguel and Elena?" "Tomorrow," Thomas suggested. "After their first day at their new school, we'll sit down together and talk about what comes next." As they sat together on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, the creek running over stones, the rustle of small animals in the grass, Thomas thought about how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. The house that had echoed with loneliness was now filled with the sounds of children growing up. The routines that had been about survival were now about nurturing. The future that had seemed empty was now full of possibilities he hadn't dared to imagine. Inside the house, Miguel and Elena slept peacefully in their shared room, surrounded by new toys and books, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another day in the place they were learning to call home. And on the porch, a man who had thought his heart was too broken to love again sat with a 9-year-old girl who had learned to be an adult too early, both of them discovering that families could be built from the raw materials of loss and hope and the simple decision to take care of each other. The autumn months brought a rhythm to their lives that felt both new and ancient, like a song they were learning together but had somehow always known. The children's first day at Cedar Creek Elementary had gone better than any of them had dared hope, with teachers who welcomed them warmly and classmates who were curious but kind about the new family that had appeared in their small community. Sarah thrived academically, her natural intelligence and determination making up for any gaps in her education caused by their unstable living situation before their mother's death. Her teacher, Mrs. Peterson, was a veteran educator who recognized both Sarah's gifts and her unusual maturity, making sure to challenge her intellectually while also encouraging her to act like the 9-year-old she was. Miguel discovered a love for reading that surprised everyone, including himself. He would sit in the corner of the classroom library during free time, sounding out words with fierce concentration, building vocabulary that grew stronger every day. His teacher, Miss Rodriguez, who was young and enthusiastic and reminded him a little of his mother, made sure he had plenty of books to take home. Elena flourished in a preschool environment, her natural friendliness blossoming now that she felt secure about having a permanent home to return to each day. She made fast friends with the other children and came home each afternoon with stories about what they had learned, songs they had sung, and games they had played during recess. Thomas found himself drawn into the school community in ways he hadn't expected. He attended parent-teacher conferences, volunteered for school fundraisers, and even agreed to help build sets for the Christmas pageant. The other parents welcomed him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Everyone in Cedar Creek knew about his loss, and everyone recognized the courage it took to open his heart and home to children who needed both. At home, their daily routines evolved naturally around the needs of 3 growing children and one middle-aged man learning to be a father again. Thomas bought a larger dining room table to accommodate homework time after school, when all 3 children would spread out their books and assignments while he reviewed ranch paperwork and answered questions about math problems or spelling words. Evenings became family time in ways Thomas had forgotten were possible. They would watch movies together, the children piled on the couch with him, Elena often falling asleep curled against his side. Sarah would read stories to Miguel and Elena before bedtime, her voice taking on the same gentle cadence her mother had used, keeping alive traditions that connected them to the family they had lost while building new ones in the family they were becoming. The first real test of their new family dynamic came in October, when Thomas had to make an emergency trip to Austin to deal with some legal issues related to the ranch's water rights. It was the kind of business that couldn't be delayed, but it meant leaving the children for 2 days, the longest they had been separated since arriving at the ranch. Sarah immediately went into protective mode, asking detailed questions about when he would be back, what they should do if something went wrong, how they would get in touch with him. Her anxiety was palpable, the old fear that people disappeared without warning resurfacing despite months of stability. Thomas sat down with all 3 children to explain the situation clearly and honestly. Yes, he had to go to Austin. Yes, it would be for 2 days and 1 night. No, this wasn't about them doing anything wrong or him wanting to get away. Mrs. Henderson from the general store would check on them twice a day, and her teenage daughter Julie would spend the night at the house to make sure they weren't alone. But what if you don't come back? Elena asked, voicing the fear that all 3 children were feeling, but only she was young enough to express so directly. Thomas knelt down to her level, taking her small hands in his weathered ones. Elena, I promise you I will come back. I'm not leaving you. I'm just going away for work, the same way some parents go to work in offices or stores. This is my job, and when it's finished, I'll drive home to you. He showed them Austin on a map, explained about driving time and cell phone coverage, and gave them a detailed schedule of when he would call each day. Sarah wrote everything down in her careful handwriting, creating the kind of backup plan that made her feel more secure about situations beyond her control. The 2 days passed successfully, though Thomas found himself calling home more often than necessary, just to hear their voices and reassure himself that they were fine. When he returned late Thursday evening, all 3 children were waiting up for him, even though it was past their normal bedtime. Elena ran to him for a hug. Miguel showed him the book report he had finished, and Sarah simply smiled with relief that was visible across the room. I told you I'd come back, Thomas said, gathering all 3 of them into a group hug that felt like coming home in the deepest sense of the phrase. As the holidays approached, Thomas faced new challenges he hadn't anticipated. What traditions should they follow? How do you create Christmas magic for children who had experienced so much loss? How do you honor the memory of their mother while building new celebrations that belong to their current family? Sarah solved part of the problem by sharing stories about how their mother had celebrated holidays, usually with very little money, but enormous creativity. They had made decorations from construction paper, baked cookies from whatever ingredients they could afford, and given each other small gifts that were chosen with love rather than purchased with wealth. Thomas took these stories to heart, understanding that the children didn't need expensive presents or elaborate celebrations. They needed traditions that made them feel connected to something larger than themselves, rituals that marked time and created memories and reinforced their sense of belonging to this new family they were building together. They drove to a tree farm an hour away to cut their own Christmas tree, an adventure that turned into a family expedition complete with hot chocolate from a thermos and much debate about which tree was the perfect size and shape for their living room. Elena wanted the biggest tree they could find. Miguel favored one that was perfectly symmetrical, and Sarah looked for practical considerations like whether it would fit in the truck and how much it would cost. Thomas let them debate until they reached a consensus on a medium-sized pine tree that met everyone's criteria. He taught them how to cut it down properly, letting each child take a turn with the saw while he guided their hands and ensured their safety. Loading it into the truck and driving home with pine needles flying felt like the kind of memory that would last forever. Decorating the tree became a multi-day project. They made paper ornaments and strung popcorn, activities that Thomas remembered from his own childhood, but hadn't thought about in years. Sarah proved to have an artistic eye, creating intricate paper snowflakes that looked almost professional. Miguel was fascinated by the engineering challenge of stringing lights evenly, and Elena appointed herself in charge of placing all ornaments below the 3-foot level where she could reach. Thomas contributed ornaments from his marriage, silver balls, and wooden angels that Mary had collected over the years, each one carrying memories of Christmases past. He told the children stories about some of them, sharing pieces of his history that helped them understand the man he had been before grief changed him. The children listened to these stories with the intensity they brought to everything important, filing away details about Thomas's life before they knew him. They were learning that families were built on shared histories, and that even though they were creating new traditions together, they were also inheriting the accumulated love and loss that Thomas brought to their relationship. On Christmas Eve, they attended midnight service at the small church where Father Miguel presided over a congregation that had welcomed the Crawford family with open arms. Sarah, Miguel, and Elena had never been to a midnight service before, and they were awed by the candlelight and carols, by the sense of community that filled the little church with warmth despite the cold December night. As they drove home under a sky brilliant with stars, Elena fell asleep in her car seat, and Miguel dozed against Sarah's shoulder. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror at his children. When had he started thinking of them that way? And felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought them all together. Christmas morning brought modest gifts carefully chosen to reflect each child's interests and needs. Books for Miguel, art supplies for Sarah, a new stuffed animal for Elena to keep her worn rabbit company. Thomas was surprised to find that the children had somehow managed to buy him presents too. A new coffee mug from the general store with "World's Best Dad" printed on the side, purchased with allowance money they had saved for weeks. The mug brought tears to his eyes, not just because of the sentiment, but because it represented the children's decision to claim him officially as their father. They could have chosen Thomas or Mr. Crawford or any number of other options, but they had chosen Dad, making a statement about how they saw their relationship and their future together. As winter progressed into spring, the legal process of adoption moved forward with the help of a lawyer in town who specialized in family law. Mrs. Patterson, the social worker, made regular visits and consistently reported that the children were thriving in their new environment. Their grades were good, they were making friends, and most importantly, they were displaying the kind of emotional security that came from knowing they were loved and wanted. The adoption hearing was scheduled for early May, just before the end of the school year. Thomas had explained the process to the children, making sure they understood that this was their choice too, that adoption would make their family legal and permanent, but only if it was what they really wanted. The night before the hearing, as Thomas was tucking Elena into bed, she asked him if adoption meant they would never have to move again. "That's exactly what it means," Thomas told her. "It means this is your home forever, and I'm your dad forever, and nothing will ever change that." Elena considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Even if we're bad sometimes?" Thomas smiled, remembering similar conversations with his own children years before. "Even if you're bad sometimes? Even if you make mistakes? Even if we have arguments? Even if you grow up and move away to college someday? You'll still be my daughter, and this will still be your home." The reassurance seemed to satisfy her, and she fell asleep holding both her old rabbit and her new stuffed elephant, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would make official what her heart already knew, that they were a family in every way that mattered. As Thomas turned off the light and closed Elena's door, he reflected on how much had changed since that morning 8 months ago when Father Miguel had called about 3 children with nowhere to go. He had thought he was offering temporary shelter to kids in crisis, but they had given him something infinitely more valuable, a reason to live fully again, a purpose beyond mere survival, and the profound joy that comes from watching children grow and thrive under your care. Tomorrow would bring legal papers and official ceremonies, but tonight there was just a house full of sleeping children who trusted him to keep them safe, who had chosen to call him Dad, who had transformed his empty rooms into a home filled with laughter and love and the beautiful chaos of family life. In his own room, Thomas fell asleep thinking about the future they would build together. School plays and science fairs, driving lessons and graduation ceremonies, all the milestones that lay ahead for his children. His children. The word still felt new and wonderful, a gift he had never expected to receive again. The courthouse in Cedar Creek was a modest building that had served the county for over a century, with high ceilings and worn wooden floors that had witnessed thousands of legal proceedings. But on the morning of May 15th, it felt like the most important building in the world to 5 people who had come together to make their family official in the eyes of the law. Thomas had dressed in his best suit, a dark blue one that he'd worn to his own wedding and later to his family's funeral, now being worn for the happiest occasion of his life in years. Sarah wore a new dress they had picked out together, navy blue with small white flowers, her hair carefully braided with ribbons. Miguel had insisted on wearing a tie like Thomas, and Elena twirled in a yellow sundress that made her feel like sunshine. Father Miguel was there as their witness, along with Mrs. Peterson from the school, Doc Reynolds, who had become like a grandfather to the children, and Mrs. Henderson from the general store, who had quietly helped their family in dozens of small ways over the past months. Even Mrs. Patterson, the social worker, had requested permission to attend, telling Thomas that in 20 years of placing children, she had rarely seen an adoption that felt so perfectly right. Judge Morrison was an elderly man who had been serving the county for 30 years and had presided over hundreds of adoptions. But as he looked at the Crawford family standing before his bench, he could see something special in the way they stood together, not like strangers going through a legal process, but like people who had already become family in every way that mattered. Mr. Crawford, Judge Morrison began, you petitioned the court to adopt Sarah Maria Martinez, Miguel Antonio Martinez, and Elena Sofia Martinez. Do you understand that this adoption will create the same legal relationship as if these children were born to you, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails? I do, Your Honor, Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt building in his chest. And children, the judge continued, looking at each of them in turn. Do you understand that Mr. Crawford is asking to become your legal father, and that you would become his legal children with new last names and new birth certificates? Sarah stepped forward slightly, speaking for all 3 of them with the maturity that had become her trademark. Yes, Your Honor, we understand, and we want that very much. Miguel nodded solemnly, while Elena smiled so broadly that several people in the gallery couldn't help but smile back at her obvious joy. Judge Morrison reviewed the paperwork, the home study reports, the psychological evaluations, and the recommendations from teachers and community members who had observed the family over the past months. Everything was in order, every requirement met, every concern addressed. Before I sign these papers, Judge Morrison said, I want to say something to all of you. In my years on this bench, I've seen many adoptions. Some are born from tragedy, as yours was, but the best ones, like this one, are born from love. Love that chooses to see need and respond to it. Love that creates family from the raw materials of loss and hope. He looked directly at Thomas. Mr. Crawford, you've taken 3 children who lost everything and given them not just a home, but a future. That takes courage and compassion that not everyone possesses. Then he turned to the children. And you 3 have done something equally remarkable. You've allowed someone new into your hearts after experiencing profound loss. You've chosen to trust again, to love again, to believe in the possibility of family again. That takes courage too. Judge Morrison picked up his pen and signed the adoption decree with careful strokes that made their new family legal and permanent. It is my great pleasure to declare that Sarah Maria Martinez, Miguel Antonio Martinez, and Elena Sofia Martinez are now legally the adopted children of Thomas Crawford, and that they shall henceforth be known as Sarah Maria Crawford, Miguel Antonio Crawford, and Elena Sofia Crawford. The gavel came down with a firm bang that echoed through the courtroom, followed immediately by applause from everyone present. Elena clapped her hands with delight. Miguel grinned broadly. And Sarah, responsible, careful Sarah who rarely let her emotions show, began to cry tears of pure relief and joy. Thomas knelt down and gathered all three children into his arms, holding them close while they were surrounded by friends and community members who had supported this moment from the beginning. "You're my kids now," he whispered into their group hug. "Forever and always, you're my kids." After the ceremony, they celebrated with lunch at the town's only restaurant, where the owner had prepared a special cake with "Welcome to the family" written in frosting. The children were giddy with excitement, talking over each other as they discussed their new names and what it meant to be officially adopted. "Can we call you Dad now?" Elena asked, though she had been calling him that informally for months. "You can call me anything you want," Thomas replied, "but Dad sounds pretty perfect to me." That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he had been a lonely man living in a house filled with ghosts, going through the motions of life without really living. Tonight, he was a father again, with children who filled his home with laughter and chaos and the beautiful messiness of family life. Sarah sat beside him on the porch swing, finally, allowing herself to relax completely now that their future was legally secure. "What happens now?" she asked, though she seemed less anxious about the unknown than she had in months past. "Now we keep doing what we've been doing," Thomas said. "We take care of each other, we make mistakes, and learn from them. We celebrate the good times and help each other through the difficult ones. We be a family." Inside the house, Miguel and Elena were playing a board game on the living room floor, their voices carrying through the screen door along with the sound of dice rolling and pieces being moved. The television played quietly in the background, and homework waited on the kitchen table, and tomorrow would bring all the ordinary responsibilities and joys of family life. As the months turned into years, the Crawford family grew and changed together. Sarah blossomed into a confident teenager who maintained her natural leadership abilities while also learning to trust others to take care of things sometimes. She excelled academically and developed a passion for writing, often crafting stories about families who found each other against impossible odds. Miguel discovered a love for animals that made him Thomas's natural partner in ranch work. He learned to ride horses, care for cattle, and understand the rhythms of agricultural life. He also maintained his love for books, often reading to the animals in the barn, convinced that they enjoyed the stories as much as he did. Elena grew into a spirited child whose natural optimism seemed to brighten every room she entered. She made friends easily, excelled in school, and had an artistic talent that filled the house with drawings and paintings that Thomas proudly displayed on every available wall. Thomas found himself becoming not just a father again, but a better father than he had ever been before. The experience of losing his first family had taught him not to take any moment for granted, to pay attention to the small daily miracles of children growing up, to be present for the ordinary moments that actually make up most of family life. They established traditions that became the foundation of their shared history. Every Christmas, they cut their own tree from the same farm. Every summer, they took a week-long camping trip to a different state park. Every birthday was celebrated with homemade cake and carefully chosen presents that showed how well they had learned to love each other. The children stayed in touch with Father Miguel, who had become something like a grandfather to them, and with the community members who had supported their adoption. Cedar Creek embraced them completely, and they became part of the town's fabric in the way that only small communities can accomplish. When Sarah graduated as valedictorian of her high school class, she gave a speech about families that choose each other, about the courage it takes to open your heart after loss, and about the man who had looked at 3 scared children and seen potential rather than problems. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience as she thanked Thomas for showing them that love multiplies rather than divides, that there is always room for more people around the table if you make the table bigger. Miguel followed his passion for animals to agricultural college, where he studied veterinary medicine while continuing to help Thomas run the ranch during summers and holidays. His gentle way with frightened animals was a gift that served him well in both contexts, and Thomas took enormous pride in watching his son develop skills that surpassed his own. Elena became a teacher, drawn to working with children who needed extra support and understanding. Her classroom was filled with the same warmth and creativity that had helped her heal from her own early trauma, and she had a special gift for seeing potential in students that others might overlook. Years later, when the children had families of their own, they would bring their children back to the ranch for holidays and vacations. Thomas, now a grandfather, would sit on the same front porch where he had first struggled with the decision to take in 3 orphan children, watching his grandchildren play in the yard where their parents had once taken their first tentative steps toward healing. The house that had once echoed with loneliness was now filled with the sounds of multiple generations gathering around the dinner table, sharing stories and laughter and the comfortable chaos of a large family celebration. The rooms that had been closed off for years were now full of children and grandchildren who treated the ranch as their ancestral home, which in every way that mattered, it was. On quiet evenings, Thomas would sometimes think about the chain of events that had brought them all together. If Maria Martinez hadn't been brave enough to fight her cancer as long as she did, if Father Miguel hadn't thought to call him, if he hadn't said yes to something that seemed impossible at the time, none of this would have existed. Sometimes the most important decisions in life are made in moments when we don't have time to think, when we respond from instinct rather than careful planning. The children, now adults, would sometimes ask Thomas what had made him decide to take them in, what had given him the courage to open his heart again after such profound loss. He always gave the same answer. They had saved him as much as he had saved them. They had given him a reason to live fully again, a purpose beyond mere survival, and the profound joy that comes from watching people you love grow into the best versions of themselves. The story of how 3 orphan children found a home with a grieving rancher became part of Cedar Creek's local legend, told and retold at church gatherings and community events as an example of what was possible when people chose love over fear, when they responded to need with generosity rather than excuses. But to the Crawford family themselves, it was simply the story of how they found each other at exactly the moment when they all needed to be found. It was proof that families come in many forms, that love is a choice made daily rather than a feeling that appears magically, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin with the words, "Our mama died this morning," and end with "You're already home." As Thomas aged and eventually passed peacefully in his sleep at 81, surrounded by children and grandchildren had gathered from across the country to be with him, his final words were about how grateful he was for the unexpected family that had given his life meaning beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through generations who understood its significance not as mere property, but as the place where love had triumphed over loss, where strangers had become family, and where 3 scared children had learned that home isn't where you start, but where you choose to bloom.